At my grandfather's will, reading the lawyer's voice echoed under the harsh glow of the ceiling lights. Everything was going to my sister. Names: Coulter, Ames, 55, semi-retired accountant, clutching the silver fountain pen Grandpa once pressed into my palm. Ever had one object in your pocket feel like it might rewrite your whole family history? The pine polish clung to the air like a memory someone had tried to freshen up but couldn't quite erase. The old grandfather clock in the corner ticked away with deliberate patience, each swing of its pendulum marking not just the seconds, but the weight of what was about to be said. I sat across from my sister Lori at Brock Weather's polished walnut table, my palms flat against my knees to keep them from fidgeting. Brock cleared his throat, the sound clipped and careful. Per the last will and testament of the late Mr. Amos Coulter Ames. His voice was smooth rehearsed. I tried to read something human in his face, but it was the same look he probably wore to traffic court or zoning hearings. Then came the sentence that hollowed out the space between my ribs. Lori was to receive the entire estate land house, and he added almost as an afterthought, my grandfather's antique fountain pen collection. The words hung in the air like smoke, visible and impossible to wave away. My name, I realized, wasn't anywhere on the pages Brock held. Not a token gift, not even a nod towards sentimental items. I thought of the last summer BBQ at Grandpa's place, the tang of hickory smoke in the evening air, the way he'd changed the subject whenever the topic of the will came up. That avoidance now felt less like forgetfulness and more like a deliberate sidestep. Brock slid a manila folder toward me and Lori. Inside was the acknowledgement form. The silver fountain pen lay beside it, its lacquer catching the muted light from the tall windows. I picked it up, and it felt heavier than I remembered, cool, balanced, certain. The ink flowed evenly onto the paper as I signed, but my fingers trembled just enough that I had to slow down to keep the lines from wobbling. Lori signed next, her strokes, brisk, confident, as though this had always been the plan. We stood. She adjusted her blazer sleeve, her polite smile never quite reaching her eyes. "You've always been better with numbers than with land," she said, and for a second it almost sounded like kindness. Then she turned and walked toward the door, heels tapping across the wood floor, a crisp staccato I felt in my teeth. Outside, the autumn air in downtown Staunton had a brittle edge, the kind that sharpened the outlines of every brick building and bare-limbed tree. I was halfway to my car when I heard my name. Hazel Tripp. Her grey hair pulled into its usual neat twist, was standing by the curb in her navy coat. She'd retired as the county court clerk years ago, but she still carried herself like someone who knew where all the drawers were and which ones stayed locked. "I need to tell you something about another will," she said, her voice low. She stepped closer, her hand warm and insistent on my arm. "Meet me tomorrow morning. Don't bring Lori." I looked down at the silver pen still in my grip, its weight suddenly less about ink and more about secrets. The clock's ticking seemed to follow me out onto the street, counting down to something I didn't yet understand, but would soon. Hazel's words rode with me all the way down Middlebrook Avenue through the slow stretch where the oaks lean in like old men trading gossip. By the time I turned up the gravel lane to Grandpa's farmhouse, dusk had started to bruise the sky. The place looked the same, and not the same porch swing, stilled storm windows latched a rake left leaning against the steps, like it had been caught mid-thought. I let myself in with the spare key from the ceramic hen on the sill. The door sighed. Inside, the air held to its habits a faint curl of pipe tobacco, floorboards with opinions. Sunlight came in at an angle through dusty blinds, cutting the front room into stripes. Dust motes drifted in those bands like slow snow. I stood a moment to let my eyes adjust and my chest settle. Some houses go quiet when their people leave. This one kept murmuring. Hazel stepped in after me, practical in her navy coat, a leather folio tucked under one arm. I typed a draft once she said softly, as if not to wake anything. Years back. Your granddad wanted the land split different. It never got filed the way I thought it would. She looked at me like she was weighing whether to say more, then tapped the folio. We'll look, not hope. Where would you start? I asked. With where men put the things they don't want to lose but don't want to find, she said. The desk. Grandpa's walnut desk sat in the front room like a low altar. The top had the map of his life scratched into it ring where a coffee mug lived. Nick from a dropped wrench the summer the tractor quit a burn the size of a dime from a pipe set down too hot. Hazel ran a fingertip along the center drawer's keyhole, then angled her head. That's new. I crouched. The brass around the keyway gleamed brighter than the hardware on the side drawers. The screws were a hair too proud, as if whoever set them didn't bother to seat them flush. You're sure I've signed off on enough sworn inventories to know a replaced lock when I see one? She pointed to the wood just below the escutcheon. The varnish there was lighter, a thin ghost rectangle where the old plate had been. See the halo I did? Once you saw, you couldn't unsee it. I touched the face of the lock and felt the cold of the metal. The room gave a long tick from the mantel clock. Somewhere, a heat duct pinged as it cooled. My phone buzzed in my pocket. Laurie's voice came up in that forced, soft tone she used for PTA meetings and hospice bake sales. Coulter, I'm hearing you're out at the house. Don't stir up trouble, okay? This is hard enough. She didn't wait for me to answer. Just the empty line afterward, humming like a scold. I put the phone away. She knows. She always knows. Hazel said not unkindly. Let's work. We started with the side drawers. Hazel handed me a pair of cotton gloves from her folio. Oils on the hands can smear pencil, and pencil is what men write with when they think nobody will check. Inside were rubber bands turned brittle, a box of paper clips missing its lid, check registers stacked by year with Grandpa's square numbers marching in the columns. I paged through one feed store utility seed, the steady heartbeat of a farm. The smell of paper dust and old ink came up like a memory. Hazel took the stack and set it in neat piles. We're looking for irregular thickness, something tucked, taped, folded twice. She wrapped the bottom of the drawer lightly. Sometimes there's a false bottom, but that's Sunday supplement stuff. Your granddad was practical. The center drawer glinted at us. I slid my fingertip over the pull, then tugged. It didn't budge. I tugged harder. The desk answered with a small, stubborn creak, but kept it secret. I stood braced my palm against the desktop and gave the lock a firm rattle. The metal answered with a clean, unfriendly click, a sound that said no without raising its voice. Solid, I said. Hazel bent until her eyes were level with the keyhole the way a jeweler examines a floor. Not every lock needs a key, she murmured. Some just need the right kind of attention. She set a hand flat on the drawer front, feeling. See the shine on the right edge? Somebody's been in and out of this and not gentle. The ware's fresh. I felt the back of my neck prickle. Whoever had a reason to hurry, she said. But people in a hurry leave shadows. We worked the room. I climbed the little stepladder and checked the tops of door frames for taped envelopes, the way Grandpa had taught me to hide allowance money from myself. Nothing but a crust of dust and a penny the color of old blood. Hazel went methodically through the bookcase, shaking volumes to listen for slivers of paper, running her thumb across spines for the drag of an inserted note. A few bills fell out, a feed invoice, a clipping about a neighbour's 50th anniversary, a list of head counts scrawled in pencil. No letter drafted the way Hazel remembered. Sunlight moved across the floor toward the hearth and thinned. I turned on the side table lamp. Its shade wore a nicotine halo. The room warmed from amber to honey, and the dust looked less like neglect and more like weather. Hazel straightened, rubbed the heel of her hand at the base of her neck, then nodded at the desk again. He changed that lock because that's where the thing is. Or was. The plates knew the screws aren't from the original set. See the head's modern cut? You think someone swapped it to keep people out, or to make it look like nobody had been in? I asked. She smiled with the corner of her mouth. Yes. I pulled the handle again, more to keep my hands busy than because I expected a different result. The same metallic refusal. The sound carried into the quiet like a pin hitting tile. Hazel stepped to the window and peered through the blind at the lane. We won't force it at dusk. People get nervous when they don't understand what they're seeing. She slid the blind back into place, and the room returned to its narrow stripes. Strategy beats speed. I breathed out and didn't realize until then I'd been holding it. The house settled. The clock on the mantel lifted its small voice again. Breakfast, she said, gathering the folio. Beverly Street Diner. 7. Coffee strong enough to file a motion and biscuits that make grown men weep. We'll talk through our approach, what we can do without breaking anything that shouldn't be broken. I'll be there, I said. Hazel paused at the door and looked back at the desk one more time, as if it were a patient she'd see in the morning. Bring your patience, Coulter. And that careful way you read numbers. Locks and ledgers tell the truth the same way slowly, and only to those who stand still long enough to hear it. When she left, I stood alone a minute longer. The room had that late afternoon hum of a church after service, benches, empty hymnals, closed something unseen, still moving. I set my hand on the cool walnut and felt the life stored in the grain. Then I killed the lamp locked up and stepped back into the crisp air. Gravel ground under my boots as I crossed to the truck. Behind me, the house kept its counsel. Ahead, the diner's neon coffee cup glowed in my mind like a promise. Tomorrow, we'd stop asking the lock nicely. Hazel was already there when I walked into the Beverly Street Diner. Her hands wrapped around a heavy white mug, steam curling up like a small flag of patience. The notepad beside her had a ballpoint balanced across its spiral, a neat little arrangement that told me she'd been waiting long enough to get settled. The place was warm with the smell of bacon and coffee, a low hum of conversation under the hiss and pop from the griddle. I slid into the booth across from her. Sleep? She asked without looking up from her coffee. Some, I said. It was true in the same way a drizzle counts as rain. Hazel flipped the notepad open and sketched a rectangle with quick, certain lines. I once saw a family scrap over a cedar chest, she said. What they were looking for was in plain sight but locked away. Took them years to figure that out. By then, it was too late for it to matter. She glanced up at me. We don't have years. We ordered eggs and toast, and while the plates clinked down in front of us, she talked me through her plan. Get in, work on the lock without damaging the desk, and document whatever we found. I chewed and listened, the taste of butter and salt grounding me, while my mind played ahead to the moment the drawer gave up its secret. When we stepped back into Grandpa's farmhouse, the air was cool and still, the faint ghost of tobacco lingering like a guest who'd overstayed. The walnut desk sat where we'd left it, morning light tracing a pale ladder up its front. Hazel knelt, slipped a small leather pouch from her bag, and unrolled a set of slender tools. "This is Owen Brackett's doing," she said, selecting a thin, L-shaped piece of steel. "He's on the phone if I need him." She tapped her earpiece. A faint male voice murmured something about tension and feel not force. She slid the tension wrench into the keyway and listened. The click of each pin was soft but sure, like a sequence being remembered. A faint creak followed the drawer, easing open as if it had just been waiting for the right kind of touch. Inside, a thick envelope lay square in the center, sealed with a disc of red wax. My name was written across it in Grandpa's firm, looping hand. For a moment I just looked at it. My name made real in his ink, his steadiness still somehow alive in the strokes. Hazel pulled a small ledger from her bag. "Sign for it," she said. "Chain of custody matters." I took up the silver fountain pen and pressed it to the page. There was a sharp, reluctant snap. Then the nib gave way. Half of it jutting sideways, a blot of blue ink blooming across my cuff like a wound. We both stared at the blot for a beat. The pen felt lighter in my hand now, wrong in its balance. I capped it, set it aside. Hazel closed the drawer gently, as if to tell it the work was done for now. The sound of tires on gravel broke the stillness. Through the front window I saw Laurie's white SUV turning in sunlight flashing off its hood. Hazel met my eyes. "We'll read it later," she said, voice low. I slid the envelope into my inside jacket pocket, the wax seal cool against my palm, and braced myself for the knock I knew was coming. The church hall always smelled faintly of lemon oil and hymnals, but tonight there was another layer. Barbecue smoke drifting in from the cookout, still going in the parking lot. Ceiling fans turned in slow, deliberate arcs, pushing the warm summer air from one end of the room to the other. Folding chairs had been set up in uneven rows, and the buzz of conversation dimmed as I walked in the sealed letter from Grandpa in my hand. Laurie was already there, posted at the far side of the room beside Mayor Curtis Bell. She wore a pale blue dress that looked like it was chosen to blend with the walls, but her eyes flickered when she saw me. Hazel sat 2 rows back with a legal pad balanced on her knees, Reverend Paul Densmore in the chair beside her, his fingers loosely steepled. The meeting began with the usual reading of minutes and announcements. My pulse matched the slow whir of the fans until the floor opened for community business. I stood the letter's wax seal catching the overhead light. "I have something of my grandfather's to share." I said the words steady in my mouth, even as my palms dampened. The room fell quiet, except for the faint squeak of metal chairs shifting. I broke the seal, unfolded the heavy paper, and read aloud Grandpa's clear intent to split the land between Laurie and me, with a portion dedicated to a community fund for education and upkeep of the town square. The language was simple, unadorned, his signature a confident flourish at the end. Laurie's laugh was quick and small, a sound that didn't reach her eyes. He was confused when he wrote that she said, "You know how he got in the summer's heat and medication?" Her voice slid into the practiced calm of someone who had told this story before. Hazel rose from her chair. "Certified statement from the county handwriting expert," she said, producing a folded sheet with an embossed seal. No sign of impairment in the writing's steady pressure, consistent form. She handed it to Mayor Bell, who read it with a politician's neutral face. As Laurie reached for her folder, a page slipped out face down. I bent, picked it up, and turned it over. The letterhead was the mayor's the date, just last month. "Thank you for moving forward with the sale," it read, "and for your discretion regarding the proceeds." The mayor's careful signature sat below. I walked it to Hazel without looking at Laurie. "Add this to your notes," I said, setting it down beside her pad. Ink from the broken pen 2 days earlier had left a faint smudge on my hand, and now it brushed the page, marking the corner with a ghost of blue. Laurie leaned across the narrow space between us, her voice low enough for only me to hear. "You bring this to the family meeting next week?" she said, the edge in her tone wrapped in a smile for the watching room, "and I'll see you in court." Her perfume was sharp and floral in the heat, and for a moment all I could hear was the slow churn of the fans above the scent of barbecue catching in the air between us. I slid the folded mayor's email deeper into Hazel's stack and sat back the letter from Grandpa resting in my lap like a steady pulse. The dining room felt more like a courtroom than any holiday gathering we'd ever had in it. Laurie's long mahogany table stretched between us like a bench, its polished surface glinting in the dim yellow light from the chandelier. Over the mantel, Grandpa's black and white photograph taken sometime in the 70s, when his hair was still thick and his smile still easy, looked down on us. In the flicker of shadow, it seemed as though his eyes were following every shift and pause. The scent of overbrewed coffee clung to the air a little burnt at the edges, and there was a single ring of it on the table from someone's mug. I placed the sealed envelope in the center, the broken silver pen beside it, the snapped nib tucked carefully inside its cap. My pulse was quick, but my hands stayed flat against the wood. Hazel sat at my right, her legal folder squared and ready. Laurie sat opposite me, lips pressed tight as if she could keep the entire evening contained by sheer force. "I'm going to read something," I began, breaking the seal once more. The paper was thick, a little stiff from time in the desk drawer. My voice was steady as I read Grandpa's words, the division of the land, the creation of a community fund, the way he framed it not as an obligation, but as a continuation of what he had always believed, that the family could be both caretakers and contributors. The room went silent, except for the faint ticking of a clock in the hallway. Mother stared at her folded hands, not once looking at me. The cousins glanced at each other, their expressions half shielded by the soft light. He was in decline when he wrote that Laurie cut in her voice sharper now. "You all know it. Summer heat, the medications, it's not the same as sound judgment." She turned slightly toward the cousins, as if to draw them into her corner by proximity. Hazel leaned forward, sliding a single sheet of paper from her folder. "Handwriting analysis," she said. "Conducted by Margaret Lyle, retired from the county court after 30 years. She notes consistent pressure, fluidity, and no signs of tremor or cognitive impairment." Her tone was calm, almost clinical, but I could feel the quiet force behind it. Mother's voice wavered from the far end of the table. This sounds like Dad." She looked up at me, then eyes glassy but clear enough to hold my gaze. Laurie's chair scraped against the wooden floor, the sound breaking whatever fragile stillness had settled. She pushed back from the table abruptly, the legs groaning against the rug's edge. "See you at the council meeting," she said over her shoulder, already moving toward the door. The hallway light caught the tight set of her jaw before she disappeared around the corner, leaving only the faint creak of floorboards and the echo of her departure behind. The broken pen lay between Hazel and me, the photograph above the mantel still watching. In the hush that followed, it felt as though Grandpa himself was waiting to see what we'd do next. The Staunton Town Council chambers were already alive with murmurs when I stepped through the double doors. Long wooden benches lined the center aisle, and the open windows framed the soft rasp of cicadas from the trees outside. The air smelled faintly of old paper and varnish, a scent that always made me think of records kept for decades, permanent, undeniable. I took my seat at the front row, feeling the steady weight of Grandpa's old watch against my wrist. Each tick was deliberate, as though reminding me to keep my pace measured. Laurie was 2 chairs down, her posture flawless, but her complexion a shade paler than I'd seen it in weeks. Mayor Curtis Bell sat at the center gavel at the ready, his expression balanced carefully between the two of us. Reverend Densmore leaned in from behind me, his voice low. "Truth has its own weight," he murmured. "Heavy enough to tip the scales if you let it." I nodded, feeling the phrase settle in the back of my mind like an anchor. The mayor opened the floor. Laurie spoke first, her tone clipped but controlled, outlining her proposal to sell the land. "The debts are real," she said, turning toward the council members. "This is a practical solution, one that keeps us solvent." She glanced my way only once, a flicker of challenge in her eyes. When it was my turn, I stood the letter from Grandpa unfolded in my hands. The paper caught the light from the tall windows, its edges casting shadows over my fingers. I read his words aloud, the same I'd read at Laurie's table, reminding everyone in the room that he had intended the land to be preserved, part of it, dedicated to a community fund. Hazel followed with her testimony, her voice steady and precise, the legal weight of her words punctuated by the faint tap of her pen on the bench. Reverend Densmore asked for a moment to speak. He told the council about the years Grandpa had given to the town, about his belief that property wasn't just ownership, but stewardship. His words were measured, deliberate, and I watched as 2 council members who had been leaning toward Laurie shifted slightly in their seats, their eyes softening. The vote was called. Hands went up one by one, and my chest tightened with each count. When the mayor announced 5-4 in favor of preserving the land, the breath I'd been holding escaped in a long, quiet exhale. The cicadas outside seemed louder suddenly, their chorus spilling into the room like a wave. As the meeting adjourned, Laurie approached. For a moment I thought she might speak, but instead she reached into her pocket and placed something in my palm. It was the old barn key, cool and solid, the metal pressing into my skin. She closed my fingers over it without a word, then turned and walked away down the aisle, her heels clicking softly against the worn wood floor. The watch on my wrist ticked on the weight of the key in my hand, matching its rhythm. The bell above Owen's shop door gave its usual tired jingle as I stepped inside, brushing the winter air from my coat. Warm lamplight pooled over the counters, picking up the copper glint of clock gears and brass fittings. The air carried a faint scent of machine oil layered over old wood, a smell that made you want to slow down and listen. Owen looked up from his workbench, his magnifying glasses still perched on his head like a second pair of eyes. "Your pen's ready," he said, the words laced with the kind of satisfaction only a craftsman could carry. He reached into a felt-lined tray and held it out Grandpa's silver fountain pen, the nib gleaming as though it had never snapped. The weight of it in my palm was familiar, but the smoothness of the metal felt new. Hazel arrived moments later, shedding her scarf, the faint scent of coffee still clinging to her coat. She leaned against the counter as Owen adjusted the pen in my grip, making sure the balance felt right. That pen should sign something worth the ink. She set her eyes holding mine, just long enough for the words to land. We settled at Owen's side table, papers spread out under the glow of a desk lamp. Hazel outlined the steps for formally establishing the community fund, the legal filings, the bank accounts, the oversight committee. Her tone was pragmatic, but I could hear a quiet thread of pride underneath. The pen lay between us, its silver catching the light every time I moved a page. My phone buzzed. Laurie's name lit the screen. I hesitated, then opened the email. A scanned receipt appeared, repairs to the barn roof, paid in full, dated just last week. No message, no explanation. I stared at it for a long moment, the faint smudge of oil from Owen's hand marking the edge of the paper. Hazel leaned closer. "Looks like she's not fighting you anymore," she said. I didn't answer, but a small warmth began to settle in my chest, cutting through the winter chill that had clung to me since the first will reading. Later, outside town hall, I stood with the pen in hand. The cold air bit at my cheeks, and my breath curled upward into the pale evening sky. For the first time in months, the weight I carried felt more like responsibility than burden. The nib gleamed in the last light, ready for whatever came next. The winter sun was low but bright, throwing a clear gold light across the church lawn. It caught on the freshly painted sign, Ames Community Fund, the black lettering crisp against the white board. A jar of wildflowers, their colors muted by the cold, stood at each corner of the folding tables where neighbors gathered with paper plates and steaming cups. The faint scent of barbecue drifted in from the grill set up by the youth group, smoke curling into the pale sky. I ran my gloved fingers over the smooth barrel of Grandpa's silver fountain pen. The metal warmed slightly from my pocket. As I looked out over the preserved land, I remembered that last summer barbecue years ago, Grandpa leaning against the fence, telling me, "What you leave behind matters more than what you take." The memory sat in my chest like a steady heartbeat. Hazel stood near the sign talking quietly with Reverend Densmore. Owen was crouched a few steps away, his camera clicking softly as he tried to catch the moment without intruding. Laurie was off to the side, speaking with two members of the council, her posture less guarded than I'd seen in months. When Reverend Densmore called for attention, the crowd drew in around the folding table. Hazel slid the founding document toward me. I uncapped the pen, its nib catching the light, and signed my name in a slow, even stroke. The ink flowed without hesitation. Reverend offered a short prayer, his voice carrying gently over the crunch of frozen grass beneath the shifting feet of the crowd. Laurie stepped forward after he finished. For a brief second, neither of us spoke. Then she extended her hand. "He'd be proud," she said. Her handshake was warm, firmer than I expected, and for the first time in a long while, it didn't feel like a contest between us. Beyond us, children raced across the open field where the barn had once stood, their laughter lifting into the cold air. The light caught in their hair and in the frost at the edges of the grass. I slipped the pen back into my coat pocket, feeling its familiar weight settle there. One chapter closed. Others were waiting. The silver pen felt warm in my pocket as the crowd drifted away, their laughter and the faint scent of barbecue hanging in the winter air. I stood for a moment under the pale sun, looking at the sign and the open field beyond, knowing both were here to stay. In the end, it wasn't about winning. It was about making sure what mattered would outlast the noise. Sometimes bridges collapse, so we can learn which ones are worth rebuilding. If you've ever faced a moment where letting go brought you closer to peace, I'd love to hear your story, maybe even share it here for others to find. Ask ChatGPT